The stars outside the viewport never changed. They just sat there, cold and quiet, the same way they had for the past 3 weeks. Captain Leon Marsh had spent enough years in deep space to stop finding beauty in them. Stars were just landmarks now, directions, nothing more. He stood at the front of the bridge with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and stared at the long stretch of nothing ahead of the ardent star. The ship hummed around him, steady and reliable, the way a good vessel should. They were 2 days out from the Karath Nebula, running a standard survey loop, collecting data that would eventually end up in some database that nobody would read for 20 years. It was the kind of mission that paid well and felt like slow time. Leon set down his cold coffee and turned to check on his crew. Pete Vance was at the engineering station doing what Pete always did, running checks that did not need running, adjusting numbers that were already fine, keeping his hands busy because his mind never really rested. Nina Cole was at the science console on the far side of the bridge, chin resting in her palm, scrolling through atmospheric data from a planet they had passed 6 hours ago. She had that look she got when something was interesting but not quite interesting enough yet. Leon liked his crew. They were small in number but solid in character. That mattered more than anything else out here. It was Nina who heard it first. She sat up straight without saying a word. Her hand moved quickly across the console, pulling the sound up through the ship's communication array and isolating it from the background noise of space. Leon noticed the change in her posture before she said anything. In 3 years of working together, he had learned to watch for it. "Captain," she said, and her voice had that careful, focused quality that meant she was not sure yet, but she was very interested. "You need to hear this." Leon crossed the bridge and stood behind her. She put the signal through the main speaker. It was not a sound that could be described easily. It was not a voice, and it was not music. It sat somewhere between the two, repeating in a slow and steady pattern, rising and falling in a way that made the back of Leon's neck feel strange. Pete stopped what he was doing and turned around without being asked. "What is that?" Pete said. "I don't know yet," Nina said, "but it has been sitting in the background of our array for at least 4 hours. I only caught it now because I widened the scan range. It is not on any standard frequency." Leon listened to it again. There was something about it that made him uncomfortable in a way he could not explain. Not threatening, not mechanical. It felt almost like walking past a room and hearing someone cry quietly on the other side of a closed door. "Can you decode it?" he asked. "I am going to try," she said. Nina worked through the night. Leon slept for 4 hours, woke up, checked on the ship, and came back to find her still at the console with 2 empty cups beside her, and her hair pulled back the way she wore it when she was deep in something. He did not interrupt her. He got fresh coffee for both of them and left hers near her elbow. By the early hours of the ship's morning cycle, she had something. She called the crew to the bridge and stood in front of the main display. Her face was calm, but her eyes were bright in the way that meant she had found something that mattered. "It is not a language," she said. "Not the way we use the word. There are no words in it at all. No grammar, no structure, no repeating symbols. What it is, as far as I can determine, is pure emotional frequency. A direct broadcast of feeling, not thought." Pete frowned. "Something is just broadcasting its feelings into space?" "Young creatures do it," Nina said. "There are 3 recorded species in the database that emit emotional frequency signals when they are in distress, but all 3 are small. This signal is much stronger. Whatever is sending it is large, and it has been sending for a long time, and it is not doing it on purpose. It is doing it the way a child cries, not because it decided to, but because it cannot stop." The bridge was quiet for a moment. "What is it feeling?" Leon asked. Nina looked at him steadily. "Fear," she said, "and something underneath the fear that is even harder to sit with. It is asking for help, not in words, but the meaning is completely clear. Something out there needs someone to come." Leon looked at Pete. Pete looked at the floor, then back up. "Where is the signal coming from?" Leon asked. Nina brought up the star map and pointed to a location deep inside the Karath Nebula. A region marked in soft red on the display, meaning difficult to navigate, low visibility, not recommended for standard vessels. "There is a planet in there," she said. "It is not on any chart. Long-range scans show an atmosphere in serious trouble and large heat signatures on the surface that are moving slowly. Something is alive down there and something is very wrong." Pete crossed his arms. "Flying into the nebula is not a simple thing, Captain." "I know," Leon said. He looked at the signal reading on Nina's console, the slow rise and fall of it. The thing underneath the fear that was asking, in the only way it knew how, for someone to please come. Leon picked up his coffee cup. "Plot a course into the nebula," he said. "Careful and slow." Pete let out a long breath but turned to his console without argument. As the ardent star changed direction and the nebula filled the viewport ahead in soft clouds of purple and gold, the signal shifted. Just slightly, just enough for Nina to notice and turn to Leon with something quiet in her expression. "It changed," she said. "What does it feel like now?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Like it knows someone is coming," she said. Leon nodded and said nothing more. The ship moved forward into the nebula, and the stars disappeared behind them, and the signal kept going, steady and soft and waiting. The nebula was not kind to the ardent star. It pushed against the ship the way weather pushes against a small boat. Not enough to break it, but enough to remind everyone on board that they were somewhere they were not supposed to be. The clouds of gas and charged particles outside the viewport shifted from purple to deep red to a strange greenish gold, and the ship's sensors worked twice as hard just to see 50 meters ahead. Pete had not said a single complaint since they entered. That alone told Leon how focused he was. Nina sat at her console and kept one eye on the signal and one eye on the planet growing slowly on the long-range scanner. It was getting clearer with every hour. A world with a dense atmosphere, heavy with chemicals that had no business being that concentrated in a natural environment. She ran 3 separate analysis checks and got the same result each time. The air on that planet was being poisoned, not by anything the planet was doing itself, but by machines. Old ones. The kind that ran on automated cycles and never asked whether anyone still needed them to keep going. She had seen the equipment signature before in old corporate records. A mineral extraction setup, the type that had been common about 40 years ago before stricter regulations pushed most of those companies out of business. Somewhere along the way, the people who owned those machines had simply stopped coming back. The machines did not know that. They just kept running, the way they had been told to. "There is a graveyard of old industry down there," Nina said quietly, more to herself than anyone. Leon heard her anyway. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that whatever is living on that surface has been breathing degraded air for a very long time," she said. "The signal makes more sense now. This has been building for years." They broke through the last heavy layer of nebula cloud, and the planet came into full view. It was large and mostly dark green beneath the haze, with wide, flat valleys and mountain ridges that caught the light of its distant sun in long, bronze lines. It would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Leon brought the ardent star down through the atmosphere carefully. The ship shook and groaned at certain altitudes where the chemical concentration was highest, but Pete kept her steady. They followed the signal to its source, a wide valley floor near the base of a long mountain ridge, surrounded by the rusted shapes of old drilling machinery that stood silent and enormous in the gray dust. They landed. Nina suited up first. Leon and Pete followed. They ran full checks on their environment suits, pressure, filtration, seal integrity, and then Leon hit the door release, and the ramp came down, and the 3 of them walked out onto the surface of Velith for the first time. Leon stopped walking after about 10 steps. They were surrounded. The creatures had clearly been waiting. They stood in a wide half-circle around the landing zone, perfectly still, watching the humans with eyes that were large and golden and absolutely full of intelligence. They were built low to the ground on 4 strong legs, with necks that curved upward and broad heads that tapered into something almost elegant. Their scales were a dull greenish gray, the kind of color that healthy scales probably were not, and their bodies ranged in size from roughly the height of a large horse to the size of a small house. The biggest one in the group stood at the front and had not moved since the ramp came down. "Dragons," Pete said, and his voice came out very flat and very quiet. "Close enough," Nina said, and her voice came out the opposite, warm and full of something close to wonder. The universal translator on Nina's belt clicked and hummed, and then gave a short tone that meant it had found nothing useful to work with. No language, no structure, just the same emotional frequency she had been listening to for hours, but now much closer and much more powerful. She could almost feel it against her chest through the suit. The large one at the front, the eldest, she would come to understand, took one slow step forward, then another. It stopped a few meters away and tilted its head and looked at Nina directly. Nina stood very still. Then, carefully, she lowered herself to one knee so she was not standing over the creature at full height. She kept her hands open at her sides. She breathed slowly and kept her face as soft and open as she could manage. The creature made a sound low in its throat. Not aggressive, something more like a question. Nina responded the only way she could. She pressed one hand gently to her own chest and then extended it slowly toward the creature, palm up. It was not a scientific method. It was just the most honest thing she could think of. The eldest held still for a long moment. Then it did the same thing back. One claw to its own chest, then extended slowly toward her. Leon watched this and did not speak. Some things you just let happen. It was the smaller one that came to Nina. It peeled away from the group quietly and walked to her with careful, deliberate steps. And then it stopped directly in front of her and looked at her face for a long moment with those golden eyes. Then it reached out one small claw, gently, the way a child reaches for something it is not sure about yet, and placed it on the back of Nina's gloved hand. The emotional frequency hit the whole crew at once. It was not a word. It was not even close to a word. But there was absolutely no confusion about what it meant. It came through clear and complete, like a hand pressing firmly against a chest. "She is in the valley. She cannot breathe. She is getting weaker. Please, hurry." Nina looked up at Leon. Her eyes were bright behind her visor. Leon looked at the valley stretching out beyond the ring of old machines, dark and quiet and deep, and he did not need the translator or the frequency or anything else to tell him what was down there waiting. "We go," he said. The baby dragons turned and led the way without hesitation, moving together in a group the way family moves, close and careful and sure of where they were going. The humans followed. Nothing in Leon's years of deep space travel had prepared him for the sight at the bottom of the valley. She was enormous. Not enormous the way a large building is enormous, where you can still take it all in with one look and understand its shape. She was enormous the way a landscape is enormous, the kind of size that takes a moment for the human mind to accept because the human mind is not built to process it quickly. Leon stood at the edge of the valley floor and looked at her, and for a few seconds his brain simply refused to put a number to what he was seeing. Vaura. Because that was the closest sound the crew could match to what the baby dragons broadcast when they looked at her, was lying on her side along the lowest part of the valley. Her body stretched from one end of the wide basin to the other. Her scales, which must have once been a deep and vivid color, were now coated in a thick layer of gray chemical dust that had settled over her the way ash settles over everything after a long fire. Her wings were folded close against her body and barely moved. Her breathing was the worst part. It was slow and shallow and had a rough quality to it, like something working very hard just to keep going. Around her neck, tangled in the space between two large scales, was a band of old sensor equipment, the kind that mining operations use to track mineral deposits in large creatures' territories. It had been placed there by someone who was no longer around to remove it, and over the years it had pulled tight as she had grown. Nina made a sound that was not quite a word when she saw it. She moved toward Vaura immediately, pulling her portable filtration unit from her kit. Leon turned to Pete. Pete was already looking at the machines. They were everywhere. 11 large primary processors stood in a ring around the upper edges of the valley, each one the size of a small building, connected by thick conduit lines that ran down the valley walls and disappeared into the rock below. Between them, smaller secondary units hummed and clicked in their automated cycles, push extracted material up through the conduit network and releasing processed air back into the atmosphere. Air that had been chemically altered by decades of mineral separation and was now doing slow and steady damage to everything breathing it. Pete walked to the nearest primary unit and spent several minutes going over it with his scanner. Then he walked to the next one, then the next. He came back to Leon with the look on his face that meant the news was not going to be simple. 11 primary units and I count 43 secondary ones, Pete said, all running on automated deep cycle power. The good news is they can be shut down manually. The bad news is they have a failsafe built into the network. If you shut one down the wrong way, the rest of them lock up completely. Every override port closes. You would need heavy cutting equipment. We do not have to get into them after that. So we have to do it right the first time, Leon said. Every single one of them, Pete said. In the correct sequence, with the correct shutdown code entered at each unit. And I do not have the codes. Leon looked at the machines and then back at Vaura. Her breathing had not improved. How long does she have? He called to Nina. Nina did not look up from what she was doing. She was carefully clearing the chemical dust from around Vaura's breathing passages with the filtration unit, working slowly and steadily. The eldest baby dragon, the one they had started thinking of as Orath, was beside her, watching every movement with focused golden eyes, and then gently, carefully, beginning to copy her. His smaller claws worked in the spaces Nina's hands could not reach. I don't know exactly, Nina said, but the dust accumulation around her airways is significant. Her body is fighting it but losing ground. She needs clean air and she needs it soon. Pete was already back at his scanner, pulling apart the machine network's communication structure. Leon watched him work and thought about options. There were not many. The ship did not carry cutting equipment heavy enough to deal with locked processor units. They did not have the shutdown codes. Manual work on 43 secondary units in the right sequence would take more time than Vaura appeared to have. Then Pete went still. He stayed still for long enough that Leon walked over to him. What? Leon said. Pete turned the scanner so Leon could see the readings. The whole network runs on a shared power frequency, Pete said slowly. All 11 primary units and all the secondary ones. They are all drawing from the same signal band. He paused. A directed energy pulse at the right frequency, strong enough and precise enough, could hit all of them at once. Every unit simultaneously. No sequence required. No codes required. They would all go dark at the same time. Leon looked at him. What kind of energy pulse are we talking about? Pete met his eyes. The drive core of the ardent star, he said, calibrated down to a very specific output and fired as a directional pulse rather than propulsion thrust. It would work. The calculations are not even that complicated. And the ship? Leon asked. Pete looked at the ground for a moment. Offline for several hours afterward, maybe more. All systems. We would be on the surface with no way off until she restarted on her own. Leon let that sit. He looked at Vaura. He looked at the baby dragons gathered quietly around their mother, close enough to touch her, but careful not to disturb her rest. Orath had stopped mimicking Nina and was now looking directly at Leon with those steady golden eyes. There was no emotional broadcast coming from him in that moment, just the look itself, which somehow carried more weight than any frequency could. Leon turned back to Pete. Gather the crew, he said. We vote. They stood in a small circle on the valley floor. Leon, Pete, and Nina, who left her work just long enough to hear Pete explain the plan. When Pete finished, Leon asked each of them directly. Nina said yes before Pete finished his sentence. Pete looked at the ship on the ridge above them. He looked at the machines. He looked at Vaura. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, We came this far. Leon nodded. He opened the comm to the ship's automated systems and began entering the pulse calibration sequence himself. The baby dragons watched from a short distance, very still, the way creatures go still when they understand something important is about to happen and they do not want to interrupt it. Leon entered the final command. The ardent star fired. The pulse came down through the atmosphere in a straight, clean line and hit the machine network all at once. Every primary unit went dark. Every secondary unit stopped mid-cycle. The conduit lines lost power and went silent. The constant low hum that had filled the valley for as long as any creature on Velith could remember simply stopped. And then the ship went dark too. Leon stood in the sudden quiet of the valley and listened. No machines, no hum, no processed air being pushed back into the atmosphere. Just wind moving through the valley in a long, slow breath, and the sound of dust settling, and underneath all of it, very faintly, a change. Vaura's breathing deepened. Just slightly. Just enough. But it was there. Nina heard it and pressed both hands over her mouth for a moment. Orath lifted his head. The smaller ones moved closer to their mother, touching her sides gently with their claws. Leon stood in the middle of the valley with a dead ship above him and a planet that still had toxic air and a long night ahead of them, and he felt something settle quietly in his chest. They had done the right thing. The rest they would figure out. The sun of Velith went down slowly. It did not drop behind the horizon the way a sun does on most planets. It kind of melted into the mountain ridge in long bands of orange and deep red, the light stretching across the valley floor and catching the dust in the air and turning everything a warm, hazy gold. It would have been one of the most beautiful things Leon had ever seen if he had not been thinking about the fact that his ship was sitting dark and silent on the ridge above them, that the temperature was dropping fast, and that their suit filters were going to need a replacement cycle within the next few hours. He did not say any of that out loud. There was no point. Everyone already knew. Pete had gone back up to the ship when the light was still good and come back down with everything useful he could carry. Emergency rations, spare filter cartridges, 2 portable heat units, a compact medical kit, a set of long-range communicators in case the atmospheric interference allowed a signal through. He had piled everything near the base of the valley wall and then sat down next to it and started organizing it quietly, the way Pete always dealt with difficult situations, by finding the nearest practical thing and doing it well. Leon checked the communicators. The nebula and the atmosphere together made a wall that swallowed signals cleanly. Nothing was getting out until the ship came back online. He set the communicators down and did not mention it. It was Orath who solved the shelter problem. The eldest dragon had been watching Leon and Pete with focused attention since the ship went dark, the way a creature watches when it is trying to understand a situation and decide what it can do to help. When the temperature dropped enough that the humans' breath started showing inside their visors, Orath made a low sound to the rest of the group and then began walking. He looked back once, clearly expecting the humans to follow. Leon picked up the supply pack and followed. Orath led them along the base of the valley wall, around a long curve in the rock face, to a place where the stone opened up into a wide, natural cave. The entrance was low enough that the humans had to duck slightly, but inside it opened up into a space that was warm and dry and large enough for all of them comfortably. The air inside was noticeably cleaner. The cave vented through a natural mineral shaft deep in the rock, and the minerals filtering the air were the same ones that had been depleted outside by decades of machine extraction. In here, untouched, they still worked. Nina checked her suit sensors and let out a long breath. "The air in here is close to breathable," she said. "Not quite, but close. Our filters will last much longer in here than outside." Pete looked around the cave, at the smooth, worn walls and the small channels in the floor where mineral-rich water ran in a thin, steady line, and he said quietly, "They have been living in here, haven't they? During the worst of it." Orath settled himself near the cave entrance, his bulk filling most of the lower space, his eyes catching the last of the outside light. The smaller dragons arranged themselves in the back of the cave, curled together in a pile the way young creatures do when warmth is a shared resource. Sela, the smallest, the one who had first approached Nina on the landing field, did not go to the back of the cave. She walked to Nina and stood beside her and then, very carefully, lowered herself to the ground and pressed her side gently against Nina's legs. The warmth coming through the suit was immediate and significant. Nina sat down beside her without a word. Leon set up the 2 portable heat units near the center of the cave and then sat against the wall and opened his field notebook. An old habit, paper and pen, something he had carried on every mission since his first one. He began writing down the events of the day in the simple, direct way he always wrote, the kind of notes that were meant to become a formal report later. But after a while, he stopped writing facts and just wrote what he was seeing. The cave, the warmth, the baby dragons breathing slowly in the back, Orath at the entrance, steady and watchful, Nina working by torchlight with Sela curled against her. He wrote, "These creatures trusted us completely before we had done a single thing to deserve it. That is either the most dangerous thing in the world or the most generous. I think it is the most generous." Nina worked through most of the night. She pulled every observation she had collected since landing and began building a formal document, a protected status application for Velith, addressed to the Galactic Environmental Council. She had filed applications before for smaller things, and she knew the structure well. But she had never filed one that felt like this. Every section she completed felt urgent in a way that kept her hands moving even when her eyes were tired. She wrote about the planet's mineral cycle and how the dragon's biology depended on it. She wrote about the atmospheric degradation and its timeline. She wrote about the machines and the company that had left them and the decades of damage they had caused. She wrote about Vaura. She wrote about Orath and Sela and the others. She wrote carefully and clearly and without exaggeration because the facts were strong enough on their own. Sela slept against her legs the whole time, breathing slowly, warm and trusting. Pete slept for a few hours and then woke and could not go back to sleep, and so he sat near the heat unit and ran calculations on his scanner by habit. Estimates of how long the ship's restart cycle would take, projections on atmospheric recovery rates once the machine stayed off, rough numbers on what a proper mineral restoration program would require. He did not share the numbers with anyone. He just worked them through quietly, the way he always did, letting the math settle his mind. At some point deep in the night, when Pete was the only one still awake, Orath moved from the cave entrance and came to the center of the space and lay down close to the humans. Not on top of them, just near. The way a large, gentle animal positions itself when it wants to be between something it is protecting and whatever might come through the door. Pete looked at him for a long moment. "All right," Pete said quietly. "Fair enough." He leaned back against his pack and closed his eyes, and for the first time since the ship went dark, he slept easily. The night passed. The mineral air moved slowly through the cave. The thin line of water in the floor channel caught the light of the heat units and ran on in the dark, patient and steady. When the first light of Velith's sun came through the cave entrance, it came in thin and pale and soft. It moved across the cave floor and touched the sleeping dragons and the resting humans one by one, the way morning light does when it is in no hurry. Leon was awake first. He sat up and looked at the entrance where the light was coming through, and then he heard it, a sound from the valley below. Low and slow and different from anything the night had offered. He walked to the cave entrance and looked out. In the valley below, Vaura was moving, not standing, not yet, but her head was lifting, slowly and with clear effort, from the ground where it had rested since they arrived. Her neck rose in a long, careful curve. Her eyes opened, amber, vast, catching the morning light the way still water catches it, and she looked up the valley wall to where Leon was standing in the cave entrance. The emotional frequency came without warning, the way a wave comes when you are not looking at the water. It moved through Leon from his chest outward, and it was not complicated or layered or difficult to understand. It was the simplest thing in the world. Thank you. Leon stood in the morning light with that feeling moving through him and did not move for a long moment. Then he heard Pete behind him say, "The ship just pinged. She is restarting." Leon nodded. He looked down at Vaura one more time. She was still watching him, steady and calm, her breathing slower and deeper than it had been the night before. He put one hand briefly to his chest, the way Nina had done on the landing field the day before. Vaura held his gaze for a moment longer. Then, very slowly, she did the same. The ardent star came back to life the way a person wakes from a very deep sleep, slowly, in stages, with small signs of life appearing one at a time before the whole thing was fully itself again. First, the low hum of the power grid returning. Then the navigation lights along the hull, blinking once and holding steady. Then the full system confirmation tone that Pete had been waiting for since the night before, which came through on his scanner and made him close his eyes briefly in relief before he stood up and started moving. "Full restart," he said. "She is good. No permanent damage." Leon looked at him. "You said minor damage last night." "I was being cautious," Pete said, and picked up the supply pack without further comment. They gathered everything from the cave and made their way back down the valley in the early morning light. The air outside was still not clean. Recovery would take time, months at minimum, possibly longer. But the difference from the day before was already measurable on Nina's sensors. Without the machines pushing processed chemicals back into the atmosphere every few minutes, the planet had already begun the slow work of correcting itself. The baby dragons came with them, all of them, moving in a loose group around the three humans the way they had done since the beginning, close enough to be present but careful not to crowd. Sela stayed near Nina. Orath walked beside Leon, matching his pace with a kind of quiet deliberateness that felt less like an animal following a human and more like two individuals walking together toward the same place. Vaura was sitting up when they reached the valley floor. Not standing. Sitting was enough for now, and it was more than she had managed in what Leon suspected had been a very long time. Her head was raised, and her eyes were clear, and she watched the group approach with an expression that did not need any emotional frequency to read. The gray chemical dust still coated her scales in patches, but it was already breaking apart at the edges where the cleaner morning air was reaching her, falling away in slow, dry flakes that drifted down around her like ash cooling after a fire goes out. Nina went to her directly and continued the work she had started the day before, clearing the remaining dust from around Vaura's breathing passages with the filtration unit, working carefully and quietly. Vaura held perfectly still and let her. Orath settled beside his mother and rested his head against her side, and Vaura turned and touched the top of his head with her chin, gently, the way a parent does when a child has been frightened for a long time and the frightening thing is finally over. Leon watched this and then turned away to give them the moment. Pete was already halfway up the valley wall, heading back to the ship. Leon followed. There was work to do. Back aboard the Ardent Star, Leon went straight to the communications console. The ship's systems were fully online now, and the long-range transmitter was clear. He opened a formal channel to the Human Exploration Authority and began composing the incident report, working through it section by section in the direct and factual way that official reports required. He recorded the signal, the planet, the machines, the dragons, the atmospheric data, all of it. He attached Nina's preliminary observations as a supporting document. Then he stopped and sat for a moment. He thought about what the report would do once it was received. Someone would read it, flag it for review, pass it up the chain. It would become a file. Files moved slowly, and Velith needed something that moved faster than a file. He opened a second channel. This one went to the Galactic Environmental Council directly, marked urgent, with a personal note from Leon attached to the front of the formal document. The note was short. It said that he had seen many things in his years of exploration, and that he did not use the word urgent lightly, and that whatever the Council's current workload looked like, this planet and the creatures on it deserved the fastest response the Council could manage. He sent both transmissions and sat back. Nina came aboard an hour later with her completed protection application. It was thorough and precise and carefully written, and Leon read through it in full before he said anything. When he finished, he looked up at her. "This is very good," he said. "I know," she said simply, and held out the document for the crew's signatures. Pete signed first, leaning over Nina's shoulder with the stylus, and writing his name in the large, practical handwriting he used for everything. Leon signed second. Nina signed last, and then she transmitted the application to the Galactic Environmental Council as a companion document to Leon's urgent flag. They went back down to the valley together after that, because leaving without saying a proper farewell was not something any of them were prepared to do. The baby dragons were gathered near Vaura, who had shifted her position since the morning and was now resting in a way that looked more comfortable. Her head up, her breathing steady, her eyes moving calmly between her children and the three humans coming down the valley toward her. Leon stood in front of the group and was trying to think of whether there was any gesture adequate for this moment when Orath solved the problem for him. The eldest dragon turned and walked a short distance away and then came back carrying something in his front claws, held carefully the way something precious is carried. He stopped in front of Leon and lowered his head and extended his claws forward. Resting in them was a single scale. It was large, roughly the size of a dinner plate, and it had clearly shed recently and naturally, its edges smooth and clean. Up close, it had a faint golden sheen to it that the dust had been hiding, a deep, warm color that shifted slightly depending on the angle of the light. It was still warm from Orath's body. Nina leaned close to Leon and said quietly, "A shed scale. I read about this in 2 separate xenobiology papers about species with strong family bonds. Offering one is the deepest form of trust. It means you are considered part of the group, part of the family." Leon looked at the scale in Orath's extended claws, and then at Orath's golden eyes watching him steadily. He reached out and took it with both hands. It was heavier than it looked and warmer than he expected, and he held it carefully, the way you hold something you understand the value of. He pressed it gently once against his chest, the same gesture they had all been using since the beginning, and Orath held his gaze, and the emotional frequency that came through in that moment was quiet and complete, and did not need any translation at all. Pete cleared his throat behind them, which was how Pete handled moments that affected him more than he wanted to show. They said their farewells in the only language that had ever worked between them, gesture and presence, and the slow, honest broadcast of feeling. Nina knelt in front of Sela one last time, and the small dragon pressed her claw to Nina's hand the way she had done on the very first day. But the feeling that came through now was entirely different from that first desperate plea. It was calm. It was safe. It was something close to gratitude, so complete it had moved past the need to express itself urgently and settled into something quieter and deeper. The walk back up to the ship was long, and none of them hurried it. When the ramp came up and the ardent star lifted from the surface of Velith, Leon stood at the viewport and watched the valley fall away below them. The baby dragons had gathered on the open ground near the landing site, and they stood together watching the ship rise. As the distance grew, Leon saw something he had not expected. Wings. Small ones, still growing, tucked close against the young dragons' bodies until this moment. As the ship climbed, the wings began to open, slowly, carefully, as though being tried for the first time in clean air. They were not large enough yet for flight, but they spread wide against the morning light of Velith, bright and new, catching the sun the way sails catch wind. Leon watched until the clouds took the valley from view. Then he turned from the viewport and walked to the bridge. 6 months later, the Galactic Environmental Council approved Velith's protected planetary status in a decision that moved faster than any comparable case in the Council's recent record. A small human research station was established on the surface with the full cooperation of the Dragon family, its location chosen by Orath himself, who led the survey team to a wide, flat shelf of ground near the cave that had sheltered the humans on their first night. Vaura recovered fully over the following season. Her scales returned to their true color, a deep and vivid green that the crew of the Ardent Star had never seen, but Nina had guessed at from the undertones beneath the dust. She was seen flying again for the first time in years on a clear morning in the third month after the machines went dark, and the research team on the surface stopped whatever they were doing and watched her until she disappeared over the mountain ridge. The shed scale that Orath had given to Leon hung in a small case on the wall of the Ardent Stars Bridge, just to the left of the main viewport, where the light caught it every morning and brought out the gold. Nina's xenobiology report on the dragons of Velith became the most widely read paper in her field that year. She dedicated it simply, in the first line, to Sela. And on the surface of Velith, on a warm afternoon some months after all of this, a young human researcher sat cross-legged on the clean ground outside the research station with her field notes open in her lap, and Sela settled comfortably beside her, the small dragon's eyes half closed in the afternoon warmth, one claw resting lightly on the researcher's knee. Above them both, high and wide and unhurried, Vaura crossed the sky on slow and steady wings. The air below her was clean and bright, and the valley that had been gray and dying was green again, and the machines that had run without kindness for so long were silent and still, and the world they had nearly taken apart was, quietly and without any drama, putting itself back together.